In the remote hills of eastern Kentucky, 43 miles from what would become Lexington, lies an abandoned copper mine that local authorities have kept sealed since 1847. The official records state it was closed due to structural instability, but the truth buried within those tunnels tells a far more disturbing story. Between 1792 and 1845, 3 generations of the Hartwell family extracted over 2 million pounds of copper from these hills, making them one of the wealthiest mining families in early America. Yet by 1845, not a single living Hartwell remained to enjoy their fortune. When investigators finally entered those tunnels, what they found would challenge everything we thought we knew about the lengths a family would go to protect their secrets, and the horrifying price they were willing to pay for wealth. The Hartwell copper was so pure that it commanded premium prices in markets from Louisville to New Orleans, yet no one could explain how a family of uneducated laborers had managed to extract such quality ore using primitive equipment. Local records show that between 1800 and 1840, the Hartwells produced copper worth what would equal millions in today's currency. But they lived like hermits, rarely venturing into town and purchasing only the most basic supplies. When officials finally investigated their operation in 1845, they found evidence of mining techniques that wouldn't be formally developed for another 50 years, and something far more disturbing, the systematic documentation of human suffering spanning 3 generations. Before we continue with the story of the Hartwell mining empire and uncover the disturbing truth that lies buried beneath Kentucky soil, I want to hear from you. Hit that subscribe button if you're ready for stories that reveal the darkest chapters of American history, and let me know in the comments what state you're listening from. I love connecting with fellow mystery enthusiasts from across the country. What makes the Hartwell case particularly chilling is that everything I'm about to tell you is documented in county records, mining surveys, and family correspondence that survived in the basement of the old Jefferson County Courthouse until 1963, when most of it was mysteriously destroyed in a fire that investigators could never fully explain. The few documents that survived that fire were transferred to federal custody under circumstances so secretive that even the county clerk who handled the transfer was never told where they were taken. The year 1792 marked Kentucky's admission to the Union as the 15th state, and with it came a flood of settlers eager to claim their piece of the American frontier. The Cumberland Gap had become a highway for families fleeing the crowded conditions and economic limitations of the eastern seaboard, all chasing the promise of land, opportunity, and the kind of prosperity that seemed impossible in the established colonies. Among these pioneers were the Hartwell brothers, Caleb, aged 34, Silas, 32, and young Jeremiah, barely 25. They arrived in the Cumberland Gap region with little more than mining tools inherited from their father's failed ironworks in western Pennsylvania, and an unshakable belief that the Kentucky hills held fortune for those brave enough to dig for it. The brothers were products of their harsh environment, shaped by generations of industrial labor that had slowly poisoned their family line. Their father, Tobias Hartwell, had spent his life clawing copper and iron from Pennsylvania mountainsides, breathing metal dust until it blackened his lungs and claimed his life at 43. Their grandfather, Ezekiel, had worked the same mines before him, dying of what local physicians called miner's consumption at an even younger age. Their mother, Sarah, had died in childbirth trying to deliver a 4th son, her body weakened by years of exposure to the metal dust that permeated their home. This legacy of industrial death had left the brothers to raise themselves in the shadow of grinding poverty and a family history that seemed cursed by metal and stone. This background forged them into men who understood that in America, wealth was not inherited. It was torn from the earth with bloody hands and unwavering determination. But it also gave them an intimate knowledge of mining techniques, metallurgy, and the human cost of extracting wealth from stone. They had watched their father experiment with different extraction methods, seen him modify tools to work more efficiently in dangerous conditions, and most importantly, They had observed his meticulous documentation of which techniques killed workers quickly and which allowed them to survive long enough to be profitable. Caleb, the eldest, possessed the sharp business mind that would later orchestrate the family's rise and catastrophic fall. His letters to suppliers in Louisville, preserved in the Kentucky Historical Society archives, reveal a man obsessed with precision and secrecy. He could calculate ore yields, estimate market prices, and negotiate transportation contracts with a sophistication that suggested formal education. Yet no records exist of him ever attending school. His handwriting was precise and educated, his knowledge of chemistry and metallurgy extensive, and his understanding of human anatomy disturbingly detailed for a frontier miner. Silas was the muscle, broad-shouldered and tireless, capable of working 16-hour shifts in conditions that would break lesser men. But Pennsylvania mining records suggest that Silas had also worked as an overseer in operations that used both free and slave labor, developing techniques for managing workers in extremely dangerous conditions. His expertise in what he euphemistically called labor efficiency would prove crucial when the family began expanding their operations beyond simple copper extraction. Jeremiah, despite his youth, had an almost supernatural ability to read rock formations and trace mineral veins through solid stone. This skill, passed down through generations of Hartwell miners, allowed him to locate ore deposits that other prospectors missed entirely. But Jeremiah also possessed something his older brothers lacked: a detailed journal inherited from his grandfather that contained mining techniques, chemical formulas, and what appeared to be medical observations spanning 3 generations of Pennsylvania mining operations. The land they eventually claimed sat in a valley where 3 small creeks converged, creating what early settlers called the Copper Basin, due to the distinctive green streaks visible in the exposed rock faces. Previous prospectors had dismissed the area as too remote and difficult to access, but the Hartwell brothers saw opportunity where others saw obstacles. The isolation that deterred other miners was exactly what they needed for the kind of operation they had in mind. They built their first cabin on a ridge overlooking the valley, positioned strategically to monitor anyone approaching their claim. The cabin was constructed with features that seemed excessive for a simple mining camp: thick stone walls, narrow windows that could serve as defensive positions, and a root cellar that extended far deeper into the hillside than necessary for food storage. Local settlers who visited the Hartwell claim in its early days reported feeling unwelcome and noted that the brothers seemed to be preparing for some kind of siege. The early Kentucky frontier was a place where a man's success depended entirely on his ability to protect what he had built. Land disputes were settled with violence, claim jumpers operated with impunity, and the nearest law enforcement might be 3 days' ride away. In this environment, the Hartwell brothers' natural suspicion and secretiveness served them well, perhaps too well. They established relationships with local Native American tribes not out of friendship, but to create early warning systems against potential threats. They hired drifters and desperate men to work their claim, but these workers had a disturbing tendency to disappear after short periods of employment. By late 1792, they had sunk their first exploratory shaft and discovered what would change their lives forever: a vein of copper so pure and extensive that Caleb's initial survey suggested it could support continuous mining for generations. But this was not ordinary copper ore. The metal was naturally alloyed with arsenic, lead, and traces of mercury, a combination that created ore of exceptional purity but also exceptional toxicity. The ore samples they secretly transported to Louisville for assay came back with results that exceeded their wildest dreams, but they also came with warnings about the dangerous nature of the metal compounds they were extracting. The brothers understood the warnings better than the assayers who issued them. They had grown up watching their family die from similar metal poisoning, and they recognized in this Kentucky copper vein both an opportunity for wealth and a continuation of the family curse that had claimed their ancestors. What began as a simple mining operation was about to become something far more complex and infinitely more sinister. The winter of 1794 brought the first clear sign that the Hartwell mine was more dangerous than even the brothers had anticipated, and more importantly, that their response to this danger would reveal the depths of their moral corruption. Jeremiah emerged from a particularly deep shaft in early December, complaining of severe headaches and difficulty breathing. Symptoms his brothers initially attributed to the brutal physical demands of underground work. But within weeks, dark patches began appearing on his skin, starting at his hands and spreading up his arms like some terrible stain seeping from within. Rather than seeking medical attention or reducing his exposure to the mine, Jeremiah began keeping detailed notes about his symptoms. His journal, discovered decades later, reveals that this documentation was not the desperate record-keeping of a sick man trying to understand his condition, but the systematic observation of a test subject recording data for future reference. The entries are clinical, detached, and disturbingly precise. Day 12. Discoloration has reached elbow joint. Tremors in dominant hand interfere with fine motor control approximately 3 hours after emerging from shaft. Breathing difficulty most pronounced in morning hours. Appetite diminished but not eliminated. Note: symptoms consistent with father's condition in final months, but progressing more rapidly due to higher concentrations of metallic compounds in Kentucky ore. ETU. What makes these entries particularly disturbing is not just their clinical tone, but the fact that they include detailed observations about how his condition was affecting his work productivity, suggesting that even as he was dying, Jeremiah was treating himself as a resource to be optimized rather than a human being to be saved. Dr. Marcus Pendleton, one of the few educated physicians serving the Kentucky frontier, made the 3-day journey to examine Jeremiah in February 1795. His private journal, discovered in 1959 during the renovation of an old Louisville medical college, contains the first documented account of what was happening to the Hartwell family. The youngest brother presents with symptoms I have observed only in those who work closely with certain metals and chemical compounds. His skin bears a distinctive blue-green discoloration that appears to originate from his hands and spreads inward. More concerning are the tremors in his extremities and the apparent confusion that seems to cloud his judgment. When I inquired about their mining practices, the brothers became evasive and hostile. The eldest, Caleb, demonstrated knowledge of metallurgy and human anatomy that exceeded my own, asking detailed questions about the progression of metal poisoning that suggested he had observed such cases extensively. I suspect they are extracting something far more dangerous than simple copper, and more troubling still, I believe they understand the risks better than they admit. Dr. Pendleton's examination revealed something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Jeremiah's condition was not random or accidental. It showed clear signs of systematic exposure to toxic compounds over an extended period. The pattern of poisoning suggested that someone with considerable knowledge of metallurgy and medicine had been carefully controlling his exposure to maximize the effects while keeping him alive long enough to document the progression. But Dr. Pendleton's warnings and offers of treatment were not just ignored. They were met with what he described as aggressive hostility from all 3 brothers. Caleb, in particular, seemed more interested in questioning the doctor about the medical details of metal poisoning than in seeking treatment for his dying brother. The conversation, as recorded in Pendleton's journal, revealed a disturbing truth about the family's priorities. When I offered to take the young man to Louisville for treatment, the eldest brother became agitated and demanded to know what such treatment would entail. His questions were extraordinarily detailed. He wanted to know how long recovery would take, what medicines would be used, and most disturbingly, whether the effects of metal poisoning could be reversed or were permanent. When I suggested that permanent damage was likely given the advanced state of the condition, he seemed pleased rather than distressed. It was then I realized that this family was not seeking to cure the poisoning. They were studying it. The mine was producing copper at an extraordinary rate, and the brothers were accumulating wealth faster than they had ever imagined possible. But more importantly, They were accumulating knowledge about the effects of systematic metal poisoning that they believed would prove far more valuable than any amount of copper. Jeremiah's condition was not an unfortunate side effect of their mining operation. It was part of a deliberate experiment. What none of the outside observers understood was that their copper vein contained arsenic, lead, and mercury in concentrations that made every day spent in those tunnels equivalent to a controlled poisoning experiment. The brothers had recognized this immediately, and rather than taking precautions to protect themselves, they had designed their mining operation specifically to study the effects of long-term exposure to these compounds. Every shift in the mine was carefully timed and documented. Every meal was measured for its ability to counteract or enhance the absorption of metals, and every symptom was recorded with scientific precision. The first death came in spring 1796, when Jeremiah collapsed while working the deepest part of the mine. His brothers found him convulsing violently. His lips and fingernails turned a distinctive blue-black color that they had seen before in their father's final days. But rather than rushing to help him or seeking medical attention, they spent precious minutes documenting his final symptoms before attempting any aid. Jeremiah's death was not a tragic accident. It was the successful completion of the first phase of what would become a multi-generational experiment in human toxicology. His final words, recorded in Caleb's journal, were not pleas for help or expressions of regret, but clinical observations. Vision narrowing from periphery inward, metallic taste intensifying. Muscle control failing in predictable sequence. Cognitive function remains clear despite physical deterioration. Recommend reduced exposure intervals for future subjects to extend observation period. They buried him in an unmarked grave on the ridge above their claim, but not before conducting what they euphemistically called a final examination. Caleb's medical knowledge, acquired through years of observing industrial poisoning cases in Pennsylvania, allowed him to perform a crude autopsy that revealed the extent of metal accumulation in Jeremiah's organs. His notes from this examination, found decades later, show the cold precision of a researcher rather than the grief of a brother. Subject expired after 127 days of controlled exposure. Liver shows extensive copper deposits consistent with predicted accumulation rates. Bone tissue displays characteristic lead staining throughout skeleton. Brain tissue examination limited by available tools, but visible mercury deposits in cerebral cortex explain observed neurological symptoms. Recommend extending exposure period for future subjects to better document progression patterns. By 1797, both surviving brothers were showing symptoms similar to Jeremiah's, but they had also made another discovery that would seal their family's fate and transform their mining operation into something far more sinister. In exploring new tunnels after Jeremiah's death, they had found evidence of what appeared to be prehistoric mining operations, crude stone tools and partially excavated galleries that suggested indigenous peoples had been extracting metal from these hills for centuries. More disturbing were the skeletal remains they found scattered throughout the deeper tunnels, bones that bore the same distinctive green staining they were beginning to see on their own skin. These ancient remains suggested that the toxic effects of the mine had been claiming victims for generations. But they also suggested something else that would transform the brothers' understanding of their situation. Survival was possible for those who approached the poisoning systematically and scientifically. Among the scattered bones, Caleb found several complete skeletons that showed evidence of surviving metal poisoning for extended periods. Individuals who had clearly lived with the toxic effects for years rather than months. These remains suggested that with proper management and careful exposure control, it was possible to survive the mine's toxins long enough to extract significant wealth, provided one was willing to accept the eventual cost. This discovery transformed the brothers' understanding of their situation. They were not simply dying from an industrial accident. They were participants in a natural selection process that had been ongoing for centuries. Those who could manage the poisoning systematically would survive long enough to profit. Those who couldn't would contribute their remains to the growing collection in the deeper tunnels. The deaths in the Hartwell mine might have been forgotten, another tragedy lost to the harsh realities of frontier life, except for a discovery made in 1823 that would cast long shadows over everything the family had built and reveal that their operation had expanded far beyond anything the local community had imagined. Samuel Crawford, a land surveyor working to establish new county boundaries, was mapping the area around the old Hartwell claim when he stumbled upon something that defied explanation and suggested that the mining operation had been far more extensive and far more systematic than anyone had suspected. In a ravine approximately 200 yards from the mine entrance, Crawford discovered what he initially took to be an ancient burial ground. Dozens of shallow graves dotted the hillside, marked only by rough stone cairns that bore no names, dates, or identifying information. The graves were arranged in careful rows that suggested systematic burial over an extended period, and the sheer number of burial sites indicated a death toll that far exceeded what could be explained by normal mining accidents or frontier hardships. But when Crawford and his survey team began excavating to determine if the graves predated European settlement, a crucial factor in establishing land ownership rights, they made a horrifying discovery that would haunt the region for decades. The skeletal remains were not ancient at all. Fabric scraps, metal buttons, and other artifacts clearly dated them to the late 18th and early 19th centuries, placing them squarely within the period of Hartwell mining operations. More disturbing still, many of the skeletons bore clear evidence of the same bone deformities and mineral staining found in known cases of heavy metal poisoning. The bones showed the characteristic green staining of copper accumulation, the brittle texture associated with lead poisoning, and the degraded joint structures that resulted from prolonged exposure to arsenic. But perhaps most chilling of all was the age and apparent background of the remains. Crawford's survey team determined that at least 30 of the 47 skeletons were those of children, some appearing to be no more than infants, while others showed evidence of having been robust adults before succumbing to systematic poisoning. The children's remains were particularly disturbing because they showed evidence of having lived with metal poisoning for extended periods before death. Their bones displayed the gradual deformation patterns associated with chronic exposure, rather than the acute damage seen in accidental poisoning cases. This suggested that these children had been deliberately exposed to toxic conditions over months or years, their progress carefully monitored until the poisoning finally claimed their lives. Crawford's official report, filed with the Kentucky territorial government, was deliberately vague about the details of his discovery. His private correspondence with his brother in Virginia, however, preserved in the Virginia Historical Society archives, tells a different story. We have uncovered something truly dreadful in the hills east of Lexington. The Hartwell family, who we believed had simply abandoned their mining claim and departed for parts unknown, appears to have left behind evidence of systematic murder spanning decades. The number of infant and child remains suggests either an epidemic of unprecedented proportions or something far more sinister. The arrangement of the graves and the condition of the remains suggest deliberate poisoning conducted over extended periods. I have instructed my men to seal the burial site and speak of it to no one, but I fear we have discovered only a small portion of what these people were doing in their isolated valley. But Crawford's survey had revealed only the beginning of the Hartwell family's dark legacy. Local residents, emboldened by official investigation of the burial site, began coming forward with disturbing stories they had kept secret for decades. These testimonies painted a picture of the Hartwell operation that was far more extensive and far more sinister than anyone had previously imagined. Martha Hensley, whose family had farmed land adjacent to the Hartwell claim, told authorities about strange sounds that echoed from the mine at all hours. Not the typical sounds of mining, but something far more disturbing. Her sworn statement, which remained sealed in county records until 1952, described nocturnal activities that suggested the mine was being used for purposes far beyond copper extraction. "We'd hear them crying," Martha testified. Not crying like adults cry when they're hurt or angry, but the sound children make when they're in terrible pain and there's no one to help them. It would go on for hours, echoing up from deep in the earth like voices from hell itself. My husband William went to investigate once in 1802, but old Caleb met him at the mine entrance with a rifle and told him the sounds were just equipment settling in the tunnels. But we knew different. Equipment doesn't cry for its mother, and it doesn't scream in the voices of young ones begging for help. Other neighbors reported seeing small figures working in the mine at night. Children who appeared to be laboring alongside the adult Hartwell men under conditions that no child should endure. When approached by curious locals, these children would disappear into the tunnel so quickly that witnesses began to question what they had actually seen. But multiple independent testimonies described the same phenomenon. Children working in the mine after dark. Children who appeared malnourished and sickly. Children who seemed terrified of any contact with the outside world. Samuel Wickham, who operated a general store in the nearest settlement, reported that the Hartwells occasionally purchased supplies that seemed inappropriate for a mining operation. Chains, locks, medical instruments, and large quantities of what appeared to be restraint devices. When questioned about these purchases, Caleb would claim they were needed for equipment maintenance or worker safety. But Wickham noted that the Hartwells never brought workers into town and seemed to go to great lengths to keep their labor force hidden from outside observation. Even more disturbing were reports from traveling merchants who occasionally did business with the Hartwells. These merchants described seeing children and young adults working the mine who bore obvious signs of metal poisoning. The characteristic skin discoloration, tremors, and physical deformities associated with chronic exposure to toxic metals. When asked about these workers, Caleb would explain that they were family members who had inherited the family condition, but the sheer number of afflicted individuals suggested that the Hartwell family tree was far more extensive than public records indicated. The mystery deepened when investigators realized that despite the evidence of a thriving mining operation and substantial copper production, no records existed of the Hartwell family selling their ore through official channels. Their copper was disappearing into the American economy, but through routes so well hidden that even experienced mining investigators couldn't trace them. This suggested that the Hartwells were connected to criminal networks that could move large quantities of valuable metals without attracting official attention. Investigation of shipping records from Louisville and other regional trade centers revealed that between 1795 and 1840, someone had been moving copper through the Ohio River system in quantities that matched the estimated output of the Hartwell mine. But the copper was being sold under various false names and through intermediaries who seemed to have no connection to the Hartwell family. The sophistication of this smuggling operation suggested that the Hartwells were far more than simple miners. They were part of an organized criminal enterprise with connections throughout the regional economy. By 1825, local folklore had transformed the abandoned Hartwell claim into something approaching legend. Children were warned never to play near the sealed mine entrance, and travelers reported hearing sounds from deep underground, not just the rhythmic clanging of metal on stone, but voices calling for help in the darkness. These reports were dismissed as local superstition, but the consistency of the testimonies suggested that something was indeed still active in the depths of the abandoned mine. More disturbing were reports of strange smells emanating from the sealed mine entrances. The sickly, sweet odor of decay mixed with the metallic tang of copper and other minerals. Local residents who lived downwind from the mine reported that during certain weather conditions, the smell would become so overwhelming that they were forced to seal their windows and remain indoors. Chemical analysis of air samples, conducted much later, would reveal that these odors were consistent with the decomposition of human remains in an environment with high concentrations of metallic compounds. The breakthrough that would eventually unravel the full scope of the Hartwell family's secrets came from an unexpected source, and it would reveal that their operation had been far more sophisticated and far more extensive than even the most disturbing local rumors had suggested. In 1834, construction of the Louisville and Nashville Railroad brought professional engineers into the remote regions of eastern Kentucky for the first time, armed with surveying equipment and geological knowledge that far exceeded anything available to earlier investigators. Thomas Wickham, chief engineer for the railroad project, was surveying potential routes through the Cumberland Gap when his team's drilling operations intersected with what they initially assumed were natural limestone caverns. The discovery was made during routine soil testing for railroad foundation work, when drill bits broke through into empty space approximately 30 feet below ground level. Initial exploration suggested a network of natural caves that might pose problems for railroad construction, but closer examination revealed something far more disturbing. These were not natural formations. Wickham's team had broken into an extensive network of hand-excavated tunnels that honeycombed the entire hillside around the old Hartwell claim. The tunnels were far more extensive than any copper mining operation would require, stretching for miles underground and connecting multiple valleys through a system so complex that Wickham compared it to a subterranean city built by people who had unlimited time and a complete disregard for human safety. The engineering sophistication of the tunnel system was staggering. The Hartwells had somehow acquired knowledge of underground construction techniques that rivaled the best engineering practices of their era. The tunnels included proper ventilation systems, drainage channels to prevent flooding, and structural supports that had kept the passages stable for decades. This level of engineering expertise was completely inconsistent with the family's background as uneducated laborers, suggesting they had either received training from unknown sources or had access to technical knowledge that was closely guarded among professional engineers. More disturbing than the scope of the tunnel system was what Wickham's team found within it. Their preliminary survey revealed dozens of side chambers that had clearly been used as living spaces, crude sleeping areas carved into the stone walls, primitive cooking fires, and evidence of long-term human habitation. But the occupants of these underground chambers had not been living there by choice. Iron rings had been driven into the rock walls at regular intervals, and the stone around these rings was stained with what appeared to be rust, but which closer examination revealed to be dried blood. Chains and shackles littered the floors of several chambers, along with what Wickham's team hesitantly described as restraint devices of unknown purpose in their official report. The restraint devices were particularly disturbing because they appeared to be custom-made for individuals of different sizes, suggesting that the Hartwells had been holding captives ranging from small children to large adults. The living chambers were arranged in a systematic pattern that suggested careful organization of the underground population. Chambers near the mine entrances appeared to house individuals who were capable of heavy labor, while chambers deeper in the tunnel system contained evidence of individuals who were sick, injured, or otherwise incapacitated. This arrangement suggested that the Hartwells had been systematically sorting their captives based on their usefulness for different types of work and their stage of metal poisoning. In the deepest accessible part of the tunnel system, Wickham's engineers made a discovery that would provide the first clear evidence of what had really been happening in the Hartwell mine for over 40 years. They found the family's records, hundreds of pages of meticulously kept documentation that revealed the true scope of their operation and the systematic nature of their crimes. The documents were written primarily in Caleb Hartwell's distinctive handwriting, but later entries were in different hands, suggesting that multiple generations had contributed to the records. The handwriting analysis revealed that at least 4 different individuals had maintained the records over the decades, indicating that the operation had continued long after Caleb's death and had involved family members whose existence had never been documented in official records. What emerged from these yellowed pages was a systematic account of human experimentation that represented one of the most extensive cases of organized cruelty in early American history. The records contained detailed medical observations, systematic documentation of the effects of various toxic compounds on human subjects, and most disturbingly, careful calculations of the economic value of human life under different working conditions. Beginning in 1798, just 2 years after Jeremiah's death, Caleb had begun deliberately exposing family members to the toxic metals in the mine. His initial justification, recorded in the earliest entries, was coldly practical. If we are to profit from this mine while managing the inevitable poisoning, we must understand its effects and learn to optimize the balance between productivity and survival. But the records show that what began as practical medical observation quickly evolved into something far more sinister and far more systematic. Caleb had realized that the mineral poisoning affected different individuals in predictable ways, and he became obsessed with documenting these effects to maximize the productive lifespan of workers exposed to the toxic environment. The family had not been dying from accidental metal poisoning. They had been systematically poisoning themselves and others as part of an elaborate experiment designed to determine the optimal level of toxic exposure that would maximize copper production while minimizing the cost of replacing dead workers. But the records revealed that the family members were not the only subjects in these experiments. Beginning in 1801, the documentation includes detailed observations of non-family subjects who had been acquired through what the records euphemistically called labor recruitment. These subjects were obtained through the purchase of slaves from distant markets, the hiring of desperate immigrants who had no local connections, and in some cases, the outright kidnapping of individuals who would not be missed. The recruitment methods were carefully documented and showed a disturbing level of organization and planning. Caleb had established contacts with slave traders in New Orleans who were willing to sell damaged goods, slaves who were already sick or injured and therefore unsuitable for plantation work. He also maintained relationships with immigration brokers in Baltimore and Charleston who could provide recently arrived immigrants who had no established connections in America. Most disturbing of all, the records show that the Hartwells were paying bounties to kidnappers who could provide healthy children and young adults from isolated frontier communities. The railroad engineers' discovery of the Hartwell records created a problem that state authorities were ill-equipped to handle. And as officials delved deeper into the documentation, they realized that the scope of the crimes was far beyond anything they had previously imagined. The documents they had found contained evidence of systematic human experimentation spanning multiple decades, involving hundreds of victims and displaying a level of organizational sophistication that challenged everything they thought they knew about frontier criminal activity. But verification came from an unexpected source that would transform the investigation from a historical curiosity into an active criminal case, with implications that reached into the highest levels of American society. Dr. Heinrich Müller, a German immigrant physician working in Louisville, had spent years studying the effects of industrial chemicals on human health. When shown selected excerpts from the Hartwell records, Müller immediately recognized symptoms and conditions that matched his own research into metal poisoning. But more importantly, he was able to confirm that the treatments and experiments described in the documents represented sophisticated understanding of toxicology that was decades ahead of its time. The Hartwell records showed systematic knowledge of human anatomy and chemical effects that surpassed what was available in most American medical schools of the period. The documents contained detailed anatomical drawings that matched the quality of those produced in European medical centers, precise dosage calculations for various toxic compounds that demonstrated advanced knowledge of chemistry, and systematic documentation of physiological responses that showed understanding of human biology that wouldn't be formally codified for another generation. Muller's analysis revealed that Caleb Hartwell had somehow acquired medical knowledge that exceeded that of most trained physicians of his era. The records contained references to medical texts that were available only to university-educated doctors, chemical formulas that were closely guarded industrial secrets, and experimental techniques that were being developed only in the most advanced European research centers. This raised disturbing questions about Caleb's background and education, and more importantly, about who might have been supporting or directing his experiments. Official immigration records showed that the Hartwell brothers had arrived in Kentucky as uneducated laborers, but the mine documents suggested that at least Caleb possessed advanced medical and scientific training that he had acquired from unknown sources. Mueller's investigation into Pennsylvania mining records revealed that Tobias Hartwell, the brother's father, had indeed operated an iron works, but he had also served as an unofficial physician to mining communities, performing surgery and treating industrial injuries with techniques that were considered experimental and dangerous, even by the standards of the time. The realization that the Hartwell family's expertise in human experimentation might have been inherited knowledge passed down through generations of industrial medicine and primitive research cast their crimes in an even more horrifying light. They were not isolated madmen driven to evil by frontier conditions. They were the products of a systematic tradition of human experimentation that had been developing in American industrial communities for decades. As Dr. Mueller delved deeper into the records, he discovered that the Hartwell operation had been far more extensive than anyone had imagined. The family had not been working alone. They had established a network of contacts throughout Kentucky and neighboring states, trading copper and other metals for human subjects that they brought back to their underground laboratories. The records contained correspondence with individuals identified only by initials or code names, suggesting a level of operational security that indicated professional criminal organization. Bills of sale found in the deepest parts of the mine documented the purchase of slaves, indentured servants, and kidnapped individuals from as far away as New Orleans and Baltimore. The Hartwell family had been operating what amounted to a human trafficking ring, funneling victims into their experimental programs under the guise of legitimate mining labor. The prices paid for these human subjects varied based on age, physical condition, and what the records called experimental suitability, suggesting that the Hartwells had developed specific criteria for selecting victims based on their research needs. The scope of the trafficking operation was staggering. Between 1801 and 1843, the records documented the acquisition of over 200 individual subjects, ranging in age from young children to elderly adults. The subjects were obtained through a variety of means, but all shared the common characteristic that their disappearance would not attract official attention. Slaves purchased from distant markets, immigrants with no local connections, orphaned children, and individuals fleeing debt or legal troubles. All were systematically funneled into the Hartwell operation and systematically destroyed. The records also revealed the economic calculations that drove the operation. Caleb had determined that the optimal period of toxic exposure was approximately 18 months for healthy adults, during which time a single worker could extract copper worth several times the cost of acquiring and maintaining them. Children were less economically viable due to their reduced physical strength, but they provided valuable data about the effects of metal poisoning on developing bodies. Elderly subjects were used primarily for medical experimentation, as their deaths could be attributed to natural causes. The discovery that sent shockwaves through Kentucky's legal system was a series of letters dated between 1829 and 1841, written in multiple hands but bearing Caleb's signature or mark. The letters were addressed to individuals identified only by code names and contained detailed reports of experimental results and requests for additional subjects. One letter, dated March 15, 1841, contained a passage that revealed the true scope of the operation. Current inventory consists of 23 active subjects in various stages of exposure, with 8 nearing termination within the next 3 months. Request additional acquisition of 15 to 20 subjects, preferably in the 20 to 35 age range for optimal productivity. Recent experiments with controlled exposure protocols have extended average productive lifespan to 22 months, representing significant improvement over previous methods. Recommend coordination with Baltimore and New Orleans contacts to ensure steady supply for expanded operations. The implications were staggering. Not only had the Hartwell family been conducting human experiments for decades, but they appeared to be part of a larger network of individuals involved in systematic human trafficking and experimentation. The correspondence suggested that similar operations may have been active in industrial regions throughout the early American Republic. all connected through networks that operated with the efficiency of legitimate businesses. The letters also revealed that the Hartwell experiments had been more successful than anyone had imagined. The family had developed techniques for managing metal poisoning that allowed them to keep workers alive and productive for far longer than should have been possible. They had learned to control exposure levels, manage symptoms with primitive medical treatments, and most disturbingly, they had begun to breed second- and third-generation workers who showed increased tolerance to the toxic environment. The correspondence revealed that by 1840, the Hartwells had created what amounted to a hereditary slave class specifically adapted to work in toxic mining conditions. Children born in the mine and raised under controlled exposure showed remarkable resilience to metal poisoning that would kill normal individuals within months. These second- and third-generation subjects could work for years in conditions that had proven fatal to their parents, creating a self-sustaining workforce that required no external recruitment. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the evidence that the Hartwell operation was not an isolated case of frontier brutality. The correspondence suggested that similar experiments were being conducted in mining and industrial operations throughout the early American Republic, all coordinated through a network that reached into major American cities and possibly into the federal government itself. Just when we thought we'd seen the worst of what the Hartwell family records could reveal, the investigation took an even darker turn that would challenge everything investigators thought they knew about the scope and purpose of the experiments. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. Because what investigators found in the deepest chambers of the Hartwell mine would reveal the ultimate fate of the hundreds of people who had disappeared into those tunnels over the decades. The final revelation came when railroad engineers, guided by the detailed maps found in the Hartwell records, located what the documents referred to as the termination chambers, a section of the tunnel system that had been sealed off from the main mining operations and was accessible only through a narrow passage that required crawling through solid rock for nearly 100 yards. The passage was so narrow and treacherous that it had obviously been designed to prevent escape, but it also served to hide what lay beyond from anyone who might accidentally discover the main tunnel system. What they found in those chambers defied comprehension and revealed the ultimate fate of the hundreds of people who had disappeared into the Hartwell operation over the decades. The termination chambers were not crude underground prisons, but carefully designed facilities that represented decades of planning and construction, built with engineering expertise that suggested professional architectural knowledge and unlimited human labor. The chambers were divided into different sections, each serving a specific purpose, in what appeared to be a systematic process for managing the final stages of metal poisoning and disposing of human remains. The first chamber contained crude medical facilities where the Hartwells had attempted to treat advanced cases of metal poisoning, not to save lives, but to extend the period of useful labor and gather additional medical data before death became inevitable. The medical equipment found in these chambers was primitive but effective, including surgical instruments, restraint devices, and what appeared to be early forms of chemical analysis equipment. The walls were covered with detailed charts documenting the progression of metal poisoning symptoms, optimal dosages for extending life, and systematic observations of the dying process. The clinical precision of these records was perhaps more disturbing than the cruelty they documented. Beyond the medical chambers lay what could only be described as systematic disposal facilities. The Hartwells had created an efficient process for handling the bodies of expired subjects, including primitive but effective cremation facilities, bone grinding equipment, and storage areas for human remains that had been reduced to ash and bone meal. The scale of these facilities suggested that they had been processing dozens of bodies per year for decades. But the most horrifying discovery was not the evidence of systematic murder, but the evidence of what the Hartwells had done with the remains. Chemical analysis of soil samples from the disposal chambers revealed that human ash and bone meal had been systematically mixed with fertilizer and used to improve crop yields on farms throughout the region. The Hartwells had not simply been disposing of their victims, they had been selling their processed remains as agricultural supplements to unsuspecting farmers. The scope of this secondary business was staggering. Records found in the disposal chambers showed that between 1805 and 1843, the Hartwells had processed over 300 individual bodies and sold the resulting bone meal fertilizer to farms throughout Kentucky and neighboring states. The fertilizer business had been nearly as profitable as the copper mining, creating a secondary revenue stream that helped fund the expansion of their experimental operations. Dr. Muller's analysis of preserved bone samples revealed the full horror of what had been happening in the Hartwell mine. The victims had not died quickly from acute metal poisoning, but had been systematically poisoned over periods of months or years. Their deaths carefully managed to maximize both their productive labor and the medical data that could be gathered from their suffering. The medical record showed that the Hartwells had developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for managing chronic metal poisoning, learning to balance toxic exposure levels to keep subjects alive and working for extended periods while gathering detailed data about the progression of various poisoning symptoms. They had essentially created a systematic torture program disguised as medical research. Among the preserved remains, Muller found evidence of the true scope of the Hartwell family's crimes. The victims ranged from infants to elderly adults, but the majority were young people in their teens and 20s, individuals who could provide years of productive labor before succumbing to the toxic environment. Many of the remains showed evidence of having survived in the toxic environment for far longer than should have been medically possible, suggesting that the Hartwells had indeed developed effective techniques for managing chronic metal poisoning. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the evidence that some of the subjects had been kept alive and conscious throughout the final stages of metal poisoning, their final agonies carefully documented for medical purposes. The records contained detailed descriptions of the dying process, systematic observations of final symptoms, and careful timing of death that suggested the Hartwells had been using their victims' deaths as learning opportunities. The investigation revealed that the Hartwell operation had continued until 1844, when the final entries in the family records suggested that the last generation of Hartwells had finally succumbed to the same metal poisoning that had claimed their victims. The final entry, written in a shaking hand and dated December 23, 1844, provided a chilling conclusion to 5 decades of systematic horror. Last of the outside subjects expired this morning. Thomas and Samuel show advanced symptoms and will not survive the winter. I am the only one remaining capable of maintaining the records, but my hands shake too badly to continue detailed observations. The experiment has been successful beyond our original expectations. We have learned to extend productive life under toxic exposure by an average of 400% compared to natural progression. The techniques we have developed could revolutionize industrial labor if properly implemented, but there is no one left to carry on the work. The bloodline ends with me. The final entry was signed with a barely legible C. Hartwell III, suggesting that the operation had indeed continued into a third generation, with the founder's descendants carrying on his work until they too were claimed by the family curse they had created. The railroad engineers' discovery of the Hartwell termination chambers created a crisis that reached far beyond Kentucky's borders. State authorities found themselves confronting evidence of systematic human trafficking and murder that had operated for over 50 years, involving hundreds of victims and generating substantial wealth that had been integrated into the legitimate American economy. The scope of the crimes was so extensive that it challenged the very foundations of frontier law enforcement and raised disturbing questions about how many similar operations might have existed throughout the early American Republic. The immediate response was swift and decisive, complete suppression of all evidence. The Kentucky state government, in consultation with federal authorities, determined that the full scope of the Hartwell crimes could never be made public without causing massive social and economic disruption. The copper produced by slave labor had been integrated into American infrastructure. The bone meal fertilizer had been used on farms that fed American communities, and the techniques developed through systematic torture might have been applied in other industrial operations throughout the country. The Railroad Survey was immediately classified under territorial security laws, and all personnel involved in the discovery were reassigned to distant projects under agreements that prohibited them from discussing their findings. The tunnel entrances were permanently sealed with concrete and steel, and the entire Hartwell claim was quietly purchased by a federal trust that prohibited all future development or investigation. But the suppression extended far beyond simple cover-up. Federal investigators, working in secret, began identifying and tracking the network of contacts revealed in the Hartwell correspondence. The investigation revealed connections to similar operations in Pennsylvania, Virginia, Tennessee, and as far away as California and Colorado. The Hartwell mine had not been an isolated case of frontier brutality. It had been part of a systematic network of human experimentation that may have been coordinated at the national level as part of America's rapid industrial expansion. The implications for American industry and government were staggering. The techniques developed through systematic human torture had apparently been applied in legitimate industrial operations, improving productivity and reducing costs in ways that helped fuel America's economic growth. The wealth generated through human trafficking and systematic murder had been invested in legitimate businesses, banks, and government bonds, making it impossible to separate the criminal proceeds from the foundation of American capitalism. Dr. Mueller's research, conducted under strict federal oversight, revealed that the Hartwell operation was likely one of dozens of similar facilities that had operated throughout the early American frontier. His analysis of industrial accident records, unexplained disappearances, and patterns of productivity improvement in mining and manufacturing operations suggested that systematic human experimentation had been far more common than anyone had previously imagined. The federal investigation identified at least 12 other locations where evidence suggested similar operations had been conducted. In Pennsylvania's coal mining regions, investigators found mass burial sites that contained remains showing evidence of systematic poisoning. In Virginia's ironworks, they discovered records of productivity improvements that correlated with unexplained increases in worker death rates. In Tennessee's copper mines, they found evidence of systematic trafficking operations that matched the Hartwell model. But the investigation was terminated abruptly in 1847, when federal authorities determined that the full scope of systematic human experimentation in early American industry was too extensive to address without fundamentally undermining confidence in American economic and political institutions. The remaining evidence was classified under national security laws that remain in effect to this day, and all ongoing investigations were permanently discontinued. The official historical record shows only that the Hartwell mine was closed due to geological instability and that the Hartwell family relocated to unknown territories in the Western expansion. The hundreds of victims who died in the tunnels were erased from history, their disappearances attributed to the normal hazards of frontier life or dismissed as local folklore. The copper extracted from the Hartwell mine between 1792 and 1844 was eventually traced through historical records to construction projects throughout the early American Republic. It was used in the roofing of government buildings in Washington, D.C., the wiring of early telegraph systems that connected major American cities, and the hulls of naval vessels that defended American interests around the world. The wealth built on systematic human experimentation literally became the foundation of American industrial power, woven into the infrastructure of American civilization in ways that could never be completely removed. The bone meal fertilizer produced from the processed remains of Hartwell victims was used on farms throughout Kentucky and neighboring states, contributing to agricultural productivity that helped feed the growing American population. Chemical analysis conducted decades later revealed that soil in some farming regions still contained trace amounts of heavy metals that originated from the processed remains of torture victims, creating a literal foundation of human suffering beneath American agricultural prosperity. Today, the former Hartwell claim appears on no official maps and is accessible only to federal personnel with special clearances. The land is owned by a federal trust that maintains it as a natural preserve, but the boundaries are patrolled by security personnel who claim to be protecting endangered wildlife habitats. Satellite imagery shows only forested hills with no visible sign of the underground complex that once housed one of America's most systematic experiments in human suffering. Local residents who remember the original investigation have largely passed away, taking their knowledge of the truth with them to their graves. The few remaining family members of those who witnessed the discoveries have been systematically relocated or discouraged from discussing their inherited knowledge. The story has been transformed into local folklore, with the true horror of systematic torture and murder reduced to vague tales of strange sounds and haunted mines. But the physical evidence remains buried beneath Kentucky soil, and occasionally that evidence surfaces in ways that remind us of the truth that lies beneath our national mythology. In 1987, construction of a natural gas pipeline near the former Hartwell claim uncovered human remains that showed evidence of systematic metal poisoning. The remains were quietly reburied without investigation, and the pipeline was rerouted without explanation. In 2003, geological surveys for a proposed housing development detected what appeared to be extensive underground cavities in the area around the sealed mine entrances. The surveys were terminated when preliminary investigations revealed evidence of preserved organic material that suggested large-scale human burials. The development project was cancelled, and the land was transferred to additional federal protection. The story of the Hartwell family forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the foundation of American prosperity and the price that was paid by forgotten victims whose suffering built the infrastructure of our modern world. How many operations like the Hartwell mine existed in the vast wilderness of the early American frontier? How many disappeared individuals contributed their lives and their processed remains to the foundation of American agricultural and industrial development? And most disturbing of all, how much of America's early economic success was built on systematic human experimentation that has been deliberately erased from our historical memory? These questions become particularly urgent when we consider that the techniques developed through systematic torture at places like the Hartwell mine may have been applied in legitimate industrial operations throughout American history. The knowledge gained through human suffering was not buried with its victims. It was integrated into American industrial practices and may have contributed to productivity improvements that helped establish America as a global economic power. This mystery shows us that the darkest chapters of American history are often the ones that have been deliberately forgotten, buried as deep as the tunnels where they took place. The victims of the Hartwell mine have no monuments, no historical markers, and no recognition in our national memory. They exist only as trace elements in our soil, as chemical signatures in our infrastructure, and as suppressed documents in federal archives that may never be opened to public scrutiny. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Or could there be more secrets still hidden in the hills of Kentucky and other regions where early American industrial development came at such a terrible human cost? Leave your comment below, and let me know what you think really happened to the hundreds of people who disappeared into operations like the Hartwell mine. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories that reveal America's hidden past, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about our history. See you in the next video.